Hello again. So we'll look at some macro models or program level design models. So I guess the most obvious one, the most common one, the most used one for me is Bloom's taxonomy. So developed by Benjamin Bloom and many others. Bloom himself was born in 1913, died in 1999. Born in Pennsylvania, he was an educational psychologist and author of perhaps one of the most quoted books in educational research, which is the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, and particular handbook number 1, the cognitive domain. So there's Benjamin Bloom. In the early 50s, he and a few others led the development of a taxonomy, a hierarchy, a classification of types of learning. And he said, when we design our lessons, one of the key things we need to decide upon is what level are we teaching this topic at? What is the thing that the students need to know how to do? Are we teaching them how to learn stuff off? Are we teaching them how to understand this content? Are we teaching them how to own it themselves and create new material from the way we teach? For me, Bloom's taxonomy gives us an idea of not only how to teach, but also how we're teaching. So a typical representation of Bloom's taxonomy could be something like this: the 6 levels, one on top of the other, and typically terminology like knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So as we know, I believe that the bottom 3 layers, knowledge, learning stuff off, comprehension, understanding it, and application, being able to apply the knowledge in a particular domain, are good and sensible things to talk about in the order they're being talked about. Whereas the higher order thinking, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, I'm not particularly a big fan of the analysis being under synthesis, which is under evaluation. I think that's highly debatable. I think further research by people like Anderson that we'll mention shows that the order of synthesis and evaluation mightn't necessarily hold true, but I think analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, all 3 really should be considered as even equivalent and not one on top of the other. And equally as well, I think that the notion of higher order versus lower order thinking is a rocky road to go down. I think it's a nice concept, but I definitely think having skills of knowledge and comprehension is as important as evaluation and synthesis. And typically we see verbs that represent each layer of Bloom's taxonomy that again give us clues on how we operate or how we create activities. If we are only want students to have a knowledge level understanding of things, we want them to define, duplicate, memorize, name, order, reorganize, so we know how to teach that and what kinds of activities we give them to do. Whereas if we want them to be up at evaluation, if we need them to be able to appraise, argue, choose, compare, defend, estimate, judge, predict, rate, score, select, support, and value, then that tells us exactly what kind of activities, what kind of lessons, how we should structure things, because we know what we need to teach them, so we know how to do it. So for me, Bloom's taxonomy cuts deep into both instructional design and learning theory. And you see various formulations of it. It is worth noting in the 1990s, one of Bloom's students, Lauren Anderson, did the same exercise that Bloom did in the early 50s, but with 20th century and 21st century educators. Published in 2001, the Taxonomy for Learning, Teaching and Assessing, a revision of Bloom's taxonomy by Anderson, was again a real watermark in my mind, a real changing point in terms of how people view education. The key changes Anderson made was first to change the labels from nouns to verbs. So instead of application, it was applying. Instead of analysis, it was analyzing. Anderson and his team felt that the lowest level, knowledge, that was a bad term for remembering, so they changed it to remembering. They changed comprehension to understanding. They changed analysis to analyzing, synthesis to creating. So they defined the art of creation as bringing things together, synthesis, and they changed evaluation to evaluating. They also felt that creation and critical thinking, the last 2 in the original, are in the wrong order, and we should swap them around to swap them around. So creating is on top and critical thinking is the one underneath. Personally, I wouldn't get too head up on this. All this shows in my mind is that different educators have a different view on what's more important, critical thinking or creativity. For me, I don't think either of them is more important than the other. It's simply they're equivalent in terms of their importance. That's why I dislike even the terminology of taxonomy. I prefer if it was just called Bloom's model, if that makes sense. So that's one of a few different revisions of Bloom's taxonomy model. And then the revised categories come with revised verbs as well. So our descriptions, we're generating new ideas, products, new ways of viewing things, designing and constructing, planning and producing. And again, these verbs, I think, give us a deep practical conceptualization of how we should both teach and assess these things. And some people have looked at the different types of knowledge and what verb you would use to describe each of the layers of the revised Bloom's taxonomy. And some people have even looked at creativity techniques and looked at which creativity techniques adhere most closely to which layer of the revised Bloom's. If you want more information about the creativity techniques, just ask me. It's something I'm very interested in and know a lot about. And here's a version again of the revised Bloom's with different tools representing each of the layers. So tools that would easily be good for remembering, like Delicious, like YouTube. Tools that would be very good for, let's go up to evaluating, Wikipedia, and then tools that would be good for creating, like blogs and wiki spaces. We move on to a new model called the ADDIE Model. So what the ADDIE Model is it's how to, again, construct a curriculum. How do we design a curriculum? We design a curriculum by first deciding what we want, then designing that, then building it, implementing it, and evaluating it. So ADDIE stands for Analysis, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. It's for me, this is a good model because it just says, how do we build a curriculum and what stages must we necessarily go through? Analysis is an exploration of the way things are and what we want to change, identifying the gaps, the knowledge gaps. Design is looking at ways we can achieve the closing of that knowledge gap. Development is to build the material. It could be educational or electronic. Implementation is actually delivering the content. Then evaluation is to find out how well that delivery went and what changes might be required the next time we do it, and to reiterate around this cycle again, redo analysis, redo design, redo development, redo implementation, and redo evaluation. So for me, ADDIE is the exemplar, the typical model of instructional design macro models. In analysis, we're looking at who are the learners and what do we want them to learn. In design, we're looking at what content do we need to produce to achieve those learning objectives. In development, we might look at how we create the lessons and the activities themselves. And then in implementation, we might see if people run it and how they get on. And then evaluation might be looking at how we evaluate both the lessons themselves and give evaluation to students. And for you guys, if you wanted to go through that cycle yourselves for your projects, if you want to go back to analysis and say who you think your learners are and say what your goals are in terms of what you want to teach them, and then break those down into learning outcomes and say, on completion of this lesson, the students will be able to do X, Y, Z. And in terms of design, look at the content and look at various potential media or presentation approaches. Again, if you want to use a morphology matrix, good for you. Then you could develop the lessons, which you will have to for this module, and then even prototype it or premiere it or get somebody you know to go through the lesson and just see what feedback they would have to give. And that could help form part of an evaluation process. So there's more clear instructions in terms of what tools you might use with each phase of the ADDIE model, which I think is very effective and useful. Just to say, and this is, I think, really important for me, the ADDIE model wasn't developed by one individual. It was rather a collective process by which lots of teachers and lots of educational researchers in the 70s and 80s were saying, here are good phases, here's good practice in terms of instructional design. Here's a good model that represents each of the phases of instructional design, and it's a systematic approach. So it doesn't come from any one place. It's evolved into what's good practice. So that's the ADDIE model, and that's part one of the macro models of instructional design. Thanks very much.